Hello, welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this channel, I do apologetics type videos related to a biblical worldview. I've covered multiple topics, including a multi-part series on the evidence for the resurrection, as taken from Josh McDowell's The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and Frank Turek and Norm Geisler's I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. If you have found value in any of my previous work, please consider supporting this ministry by purchasing my published work. It's a volume on the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms. The publisher is Zulon Press. It's available where books are sold, including on Amazon. This presentation is a continuation of going through Josh McDowell's More Than a Carpenter. These are the chapters that are covered in More Than a Carpenter. And the topic of today's video is Chapter 9, Can You Keep a Good Man Down? Someone at the University of Uruguay asked Josh McDowell why McDowell could not refute Christianity. Why could McDowell not refute Christianity? So McDowell's response to this person at the University of Uruguay was that he could not explain away Christ's resurrection as a historical event. He could not explain away Christ's resurrection as a historical event. So either the resurrection was one of the most wicked, vicious, heartless hoaxes ever, or it was the most important historical fact ever. McDowell goes on to say that the resurrection makes Christianity a historical question instead of a philosophical question. So the question is asked, can the case be made that Christianity is historical? It's asked, is there enough evidence about the resurrection to lead to belief in the resurrection? Is the evidence that is available about the resurrection enough to make faith in the resurrection, faith in Christ, conversion to Christianity reasonable? Is there enough evidence out there available to give one's life to this Jesus? So there are some relevant issues and claims to consider. Number one, Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish prophet who claimed to be the Christ, prophesied in the Jewish scriptures, was arrested, judged to be a political criminal, and crucified. 3 days after Jesus' death and burial, some women went to Jesus' tomb and found the body to be missing. His body was not in the tomb. Christ's disciples claimed that God had raised Jesus from the dead and that he had appeared to them many times before ascending to heaven. So from this foundation, Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and has continued to exert great influence throughout the world in all the subsequent centuries. So just those three claims themselves have been enough to spearhead this movement of Christianity throughout the whole world. But did the resurrection of Jesus actually happen? So let's look at his burial. After he was condemned to death, Jesus was stripped of his clothing. After he was condemned to death, he was stripped of his clothing, was whipped according to Roman custom, and then before he was crucified. For the whipping, the soldier would use a whip of braided leather thongs with the metal balls woven into them. When the whip would strike the flesh, these balls would cause deep bruises and contusions which would break open with further blows. And the whip had sharp pieces of bone as well, which would cut the flesh severely. The back would be so shredded that part of the spine would sometimes be exposed by the deep, deep cuts. The whipping would have gone all the way from the shoulders down to the back, to the buttocks, and to the back of the legs. One physician who studied Roman beatings said, as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. A 3rd century historian by the name of Eusebius described flogging by saying the sufferer's veins were laid bare and the very muscles, sinews, and bowels of the victim were open to exposure. We know that many people would die from this kind of beating even before they could be crucified. At the least, the victim would experience tremendous pain and go into hypovolemic shock. In accordance with Jewish burial customs, Jesus' body was wrapped in a linen cloth, about 75 pounds of aromatic spices mixed together to form a gummy substance, and these were applied to the wrapping around the body. After the body was placed in a solid rock tomb, an extremely large stone weighing about 2 tons was rolled by means of levers against the entrance. A Roman guard of strictly disciplined men was stationed to watch the tomb. Fear of punishment among these Roman guards produced flawless attention to duty, especially in the night watches. The guard affixed on the tomb the Roman seal, a stamp of Roman power and authority. The seal was meant to prevent vandals from vandalizing it. Anyone trying to move the stone from the tomb's entrance would have broken the seal and thus incurred the wrath of Roman law. Yet in spite of the guard and the seal, the tomb was empty. In spite of all the measures that were taken to prevent Jesus' body from moving from the tomb, it was still empty. Jesus' followers claimed Jesus had risen from the dead. Jesus' followers reported that Jesus appeared to them over a period of 40 days and showed them convincing proofs. The Apostle Paul said that Jesus appeared to more than 500 of his followers at one time, the majority of whom were still alive and could confirm what Paul wrote. Passages in Acts and 1 Corinthians bear this out. Let's see. Michael Ramsey, former Archbishop of Canterbury, believes in the resurrection because the empty tomb was too notorious to be denied. German theologian Paul Althus states that the claim of the resurrection could not have been maintained in Jerusalem for a single day, for a single hour, if the emptiness of the tomb had not been established as a fact for all concerned. We've said on this channel, I believe, other times that if the body was really in the tomb, all they had to do was just go and produce it. If the disciples stole the body, certainly one of them who had been privy to this lie that was being perpetuated by the rest of the 11, surely all that one had to do was just cave under the pressure and say, look, here's where we were hiding the body. But nobody did that because there was no body. And we've also discussed previously how the disciples, instead of, they were so fearful for their own safety after, between the time that Jesus died and rose, that they were hiding in the upper room before they even saw him. There would not have been a logical reason why they would have been hiding the body. Doesn't make logical sense. Paul Mayer concludes, if all the evidence is weighed carefully and fairly, it is indeed justifiable according to the canons of historical research to conclude that Jesus' tomb was actually empty, and no shred of evidence has yet been discovered in literary sources, epigraphy, or archaeology that would disprove that Jesus' tomb was empty. So how can we explain the empty tomb? Based on overwhelming historical evidence, Christians believe that Jesus was bodily resurrected in real time and space by the supernatural power of God. The difficulties in belief may be great, but the problems inherent in disbelief are even greater. The situation at the tomb after the resurrection is significant. The Roman seal was broken, which meant automatic crucifixion upside down for whoever broke it. So if someone's going to do something to try to fake the resurrection, they're going to put themselves at a tremendous risk to try to do that, because if they get caught, they're going to get crucified upside down and die a torturous death. The massive stone was moved not just from the entrance, but from the entire sepulchre, looking as if it had been picked up and carried away. The guard unit had fled. Byzantine Roman Emperor Justinian, in his digest, lists 18 offenses for which a Roman guard unit could be put to death. These include falling asleep or leaving one's position unguarded. So one of the reasons why a Roman guard could be put to death is leaving the tomb in this case and stopping guarding the tomb. But they were so fearful about something that had happened that they fled, not even taking time to consider the fact that in doing so they could be put to death. It was more important to get out of there for some reason than it was to preserve themselves from likely death. They must have seen something that caused them so much fear and discomfort that they didn't take time to consider the consequences that would await them for fleeing. The women came and found the tomb empty. The women panicked and went back to tell the men that the tomb was empty. When they did, Peter and John ran to the tomb. John outran Peter, but didn't go into the tomb. John looked inside the tomb, saw the grave clothes, that they were empty, that they were caved in a little. This was true because the body of Christ had passed right through the grave clothes into a new existence. His resurrected, glorified body exited the grave clothes, but it left the grave clothes virtually intact in the tomb. Seeing something like that, seeing these miraculously misshaped grave clothes, would make anybody uncomfortable and would probably cause someone to be a believer. The implications of finding the tomb the way that he did, the way that John did, the implications of finding the tomb the way John found the tomb, seem to make faith in the promised resurrection, the predicted resurrection, reasonable. At this point, McDowell goes on to briefly explain the wrong tomb theory, the hallucination theory, the swoon theory, and the stolen body theory, which it's called, I believe, in More Than a Carpenter here, it's called the stolen body theory. And in the new evidence that demands a verdict, I believe it's called the theft theory. And so there are other videos on this channel that contain information about these topics. And so they're not going to be discussed at length in this specific video. In this specific video, there's one additional theory that shows up in More Than a Carpenter. And that is the moved body theory. In the moved body theory, it's asserted that the Roman or Jewish authorities moved Christ's body from the tomb. This explanation, that the Roman or Jewish authorities moved Christ's body from the tomb, is no more reasonable than the theft theory. If the authorities had the body of Christ in their possession or knew where Christ's body was, then why didn't the authorities explain that they had taken it? If they would have admitted to taking his body, they would have given the disciples no reason to preach the resurrection in Jerusalem. The disciples would not have had the boldness to preach the resurrection in Jerusalem if they knew that Christ's body was somewhere being held for safekeeping by the Roman or Jewish authorities. If the authorities had taken the body, why didn't they explain where they had put it? They probably didn't have time to make up a lie about where they put the body on the fly, because, I mean, the Jews did make up the lie that the disciples stole the body, but that was proven to be a lie. But the Jewish or Roman authorities didn't take the body. If they had, all they had to do is say exactly where they had put it, but they didn't do that. If the Roman or Jewish authorities had taken the body, all they had to do was uncover the body, put it on display somewhere, and show everybody who was a concerned party where the body was, but there was no body with which to do that. If they would have been able to do that, they could have utterly destroyed Christianity. John Warwick Montgomery comments, it passes the bounds of credibility that the early Christians could have manufactured such a tale and then preached it among those who might easily have refuted it simply by producing the body. Yes, all that had to happen for Christianity to be snuffed out in its infantile stages, it was to produce the dead body of this Jesus. All they had to do was produce his body. But because they couldn't, because he really rose, there are many people whose lives are being transformed today. Professor Thomas Arnold, author of the famous 3-volume History of Rome and the chair of modern history at Oxford, was well acquainted with the value of evidence in determining historical facts. Professor Thomas Arnold says, I've been used for many years to study the histories of other times and to examine and weigh the evidence of those who have written about them. And I know, says Professor Thomas Arnold of Oxford, I know of no one fact in the history of mankind which is proved by greater and fuller evidence of every sort to the understanding of a fair inquirer than the great sign which God has given us, that Christ died and rose again from the dead. So if we're to believe Thomas Arnold, those who are going to reject Christ's resurrection, Thomas Arnold would call them not a fair inquirer. He would probably call them a biased inquirer whose denial of the supernatural prevents them from believing something like this could take place, from denying the legal historical evidence that strongly points to the Christian faith and makes faith reasonable. British scholar Brooke Foss Westcott, who is a divinity professor at Cambridge University, says, taking all the evidence together, it's not too much to say that there's no historic incident better or more variously supported than the resurrection of Christ. Nothing, by the antecedent assumption that it must be false, could have suggested the idea of deficiency in the proof of it. So just like the skeptics today, the only reason they deny it is the primary reason why they deny it. Not the only reason. The primary reason why they deny it is because they deny the supernatural. There is plenty of legal historical evidence that make the implications of the resurrection very reasonable. So because skeptics deny the supernatural altogether, they have this antecedent assumption that there is no supernatural. So therefore it must be false. And no matter what you say, the proof that you give for it, the evidence that you give for it, is going to be inherently deficient to the skeptic because they deny the supernatural. They keep resetting the bar for evidence. Once you meet the first threshold of evidence, they give you another threshold, and they keep raising the bar and raising the bar and raising the bar to their subjective preference, such that they can continue to reject the truth, and they can continue to have a reason or an excuse to refuse to humble themselves and repent and believe the gospel. I'm going to go through some very solid arguments in the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek that really explains this really, really well. And I look forward to getting into that on future videos on this channel. Lord willing. William Lane Craig has debated a lot of high-profile atheists. It concludes that when you use the ordinary canons of historical assessment, the best explanation for the facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Simon Greenleaf, one of the greatest legal minds that America has ever produced, he was the famous royal law professor at Harvard University and succeeded Justice Joseph Story as the Dane Professor of Law at Harvard University. While at Harvard, Simon Greenleaf wrote a volume in which he examines the legal value of the apostles' testimony to the resurrection of Christ. Professor Greenleaf observes that it's impossible that the apostles could have persisted in affirming the truths they had narrated had not Jesus actually risen from the dead, and had they not known this fact as certainly as they knew any other fact. Greenleaf concludes that the resurrection of Christ is one of the best supported events in history according to the laws of legal evidence administered in courts of justice. So there is a history professor, or a law professor at the at Harvard University saying that the resurrection is one of the best supported evidence in history according to the laws of legal evidence administered in courts of justice. Sir Lionel Luckhoo is considered by many to be the world's most successful attorney after 245 consecutive murder acquittals. Good luck showing me a criminal defense attorney who has a reputation for defending murderers who gets 5 consecutive acquittals, let alone 245. So here's somebody who is very good at examining evidence and using the evidence that's available to formulate a case and have a case that is well defended. Here's what Sir Lionel Luckhoo is good at. So he's made such a case about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And this brilliant lawyer, Sir Lionel Luckhoo, rigorously analyzed the historical facts of Christ's resurrection and finally declares, I say unequivocally, that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptable proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt. In other words, Luckhoo is saying there's no reason to doubt Christ's resurrection. Frank Morrison, another British lawyer, set out to refute the evidence for the resurrection. His book, Who Moved the Stone, is quoted multiple times in the presentations on the evidence for the resurrection that were taken from Josh McDowell's The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. So this lawyer, British lawyer Frank Morrison, tries to refute Christianity, just like we read that McDowell was trying to do in the beginning of this book. He was trying to refute Christianity. So Morrison thought the life of Jesus was one of the most beautiful ever lived. You hear a lot of people say that today. Oh, Jesus was a great teacher. Did a lot of good things, but his claim that he was God, that he's the Christ, is rooted in supernaturalism, and therefore we have to reject it. So a lot of those people who say that probably would have agreed with Morrison, who thought that the life of Jesus was one of the most beautiful ever lived. But when it came to the resurrection, Morrison assumed someone had tacked a myth onto the story. So Morrison planned to write an account of the last few days of Jesus and disregard the resurrection in that account of the last few days of Jesus. Morrison, the lawyer, figured that an intelligent, rational approach to the story of Jesus' resurrection would completely discount the supernatural event of the resurrection. He figured that he would find what he needed to be able to write something that would provide convincing evidence that Jesus actually did not rise from the dead. However, when he applied his legal training to the facts, Morrison had to change his mind. Instead of refuting the resurrection, Morrison eventually wrote the bestseller Who Moved the Stone? Like I said, that was the book that we quoted multiple times in the chapter in the chapter for the resurrection that it was taken from the new evidence that demands a verdict. He titled the first chapter of the book Who Moved the Stone. The first chapter of that book is entitled The Book That Refused to Be Written. The rest of the book confirms decisively the validity of the resurrection evidence, the evidence for Christ's resurrection. George Eldon Ladd concludes the only rational explanation for these historical facts is that God raised Jesus in bodily form. Believers in Jesus Christ today can have complete confidence, as did the first Christians, that their faith is based not on myth, not on legend, but on the solid historical fact of the risen Christ and the empty tomb. And for the skeptic that's going to say, this isn't evidence, these are just claims, I can think of one particular skeptic who likes to throw that phrase around. This isn't evidence, these are just claims. Recall the presentation that I did I don't have from the first of two presentations from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist on the evidence for the resurrection. Gary Habermas lists those 10 or 12 facts that that relate to Jesus' resurrection that are facts that are accepted by liberals and conservatives. Those facts that everybody agrees on, even non-believers agree on, are a good response to the claim that Christianity is based on a myth or legend. Instead of it being based on a myth or legend, those 12 facts can be used to argue that the resurrection and the whole body of Christianity is based on the historical fact of the risen Christ and the empty tomb. And so, speaking of Gary Habermas, he is a distinguished professor and chairman of the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University. He debated Anthony Flew, an atheist, on the issue of did Christ rise from the dead. Professional debate judge was asked to evaluate the debate, and that professional debate judge says the historical evidence, though flawed, no Christian's going to say that the evidence is perfect because the evidence requires, because Christianity still does require faith. Then again, if you're sitting on a jury of a criminal trial and you're presented with evidence and you didn't see the defendant who's on trial commit the crime, even if the evidence is completely airtight in that criminal trial, you're still exercising a bit of faith that the verdict that you're reaching is the correct verdict. So you're still having to exercise faith that the evidence that you have weighed leads to a conclusion, and the conclusion that you're making is the correct conclusion. So, a professional debate judge who was asked to evaluate the debate between Habermas and Flew says the historical evidence, though flawed, is strong enough to lead reasonable minds to conclude that Christ did indeed rise from the dead. Habermas does end up providing highly probable evidence for the historicity of the resurrection with no plausible naturalistic evidence against it. That was a judge of the debate between Habermas and Flew. Most important of all, individual believers can experience the power of the risen Christ in their lives today. First of all, they can know that their sins are forgiven. Second, they can be assured of eternal life and their own resurrection from the grave. Or they can be released from a meaningless and empty life and be transformed into new creatures in Christ. So, what is your evaluation? What is your decision? What will you do with the claims of Christ? What will you do when you investigate the evidence that's available to you? I hope that you will seriously consider these things, and if you're an unbeliever today, humble yourself and repent and believe the gospel, so that you'll pass from death to life, and your name will be written in heaven, and when you die, you will be absent from the body and present with the Lord from eternity. Or if you don't, you will end up in the lake of fire, and that is a fearful thing. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. But if you're unwilling to humble yourself, God's not going to force himself on you. And you are responsible to humble yourself, weigh the evidence, consider the facts, and it's your responsibility to come to saving faith. This life is a stewardship. In the scripture that we're told a parable of the talents, and we're told that we're given gifts, talents, abilities, and there's going to come a time when we are asked to give an account for the talent that we've been given, for the gift that we've been given. Sometimes when I use the word talent here, I'm talking about the talent as it's called in scripture. The gift that you're given. You're going to be called to give an account for that. God's going to ask you, what did you do with the abilities, the finances, the resources that he gave you? What is your answer going to be? Is your answer going to be that you wasted them? That you buried the talent like the wicked and slothful servant who was cast out into utter darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth? Or are you going to be one of those servants that did something with the talent and made a difference and turned it into more talents? Those are the ones who enter into the joy of their Lord. So what do you think about the empty tomb? What other explanation could there be for the empty tomb? Other than things that we've already discussed before and refuted. After examining the evidence from a judicial perspective, Lord Darling, the former Chief Justice of England, concludes that there exists such overwhelming evidence, positive and negative, factual and circumstantial, that no intelligent jury in the world could fail to bring in a verdict that the resurrection story is true. Former Chief Justice in England, with legal training, knows how to examine evidence and comes to right conclusions about evidence and what it points to, says that what's available for Christianity is very compelling and leads a reasonable person to the conclusion that the resurrection is true. Are you a reasonable person? Next time, we will consider the chapter in McDowell's book, More Than a Carpenter, entitled, Will the Real Messiah Please Stand Up? Until next time, thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please prayerfully support this ministry just with your prayers even, that people would find this ministry, that God would use my feeble efforts to help people, particularly skeptics, consider things that they may not have considered before. That some skeptics might follow the path of Josh McDowell, that they would examine the evidence as a skeptic, objectively, and realize that the evidence was compelling enough to where they could change from skepticism to belief in the risen Lord. So next time, will the real Messiah please stand up? Please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing my published work. And thank you for joining me today. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.